Well, Charlie, welcome to the podcast, and thanks for agreeing to come in on and chat to me today. It was actually on Epilepsy Awareness Day that I was like, I can't believe we've never talked about epilepsy on the podcast. So, well, first question on that is I always like to check whether people prefer persons first or condition first language. So do you refer to yourself as a person with epilepsy, or do you refer to yourself as an epileptic person?
So I refer to myself as a person with epilepsy.
Okay.
That may be because there's a whole suite of other conditions that go with it as well.
Right. Okay.
So I try to refer to myself as separate to my conditions.
Okay.
But honestly, no, we're all friendly here, and I know that things can happen.
Yeah.
Accidentally. So if you find yourself accidentally using the other phrase, don't worry about it too much.
Yeah, cool. I just like to check on an individual basis anyway, because there's especially. I mean, I'm bipolar, or I'm a person with bipolar. I don't care either way. Like I've got the condition no matter how people throw at me.
Exactly. I'm very much the same. I have a default in the way that I phrase it, but I don't think it's anything deep and personal. It's just the way that I've defaulted to phrasing it.
Yeah. So at what point in your life did you receive your diagnosis?
So I actually only received my diagnosis about 4 or 5 years ago.
Okay.
I'm relatively new to the whole official diagnosis world. However, my entire medical team suspect that actually I had some epileptic incidences when I was a teenager that were picked up as the wrong thing.
Right.
So never diagnosed as epilepsy.
Yeah. Okay. So what were some of the first incidences for you that would point towards it?
So for me, I began to suffer with what I now know is an aura. But basically I would come over really lightheaded, really foggy-minded. Now I specify those as two separate things for a reason. One is very much my consciousness, that lightheaded feeling.
Yep.
The foggy-mindedness, the easiest description is it felt as if my thoughts were having to swim through custard to get anywhere. I could be perfectly conscious, but the brain just was not working.
Yeah.
And that would last for 60 seconds, 5 minutes, and then it would dissipate, and it would totally be gone, and I'd seemingly be back to normal. During the time where I'm experiencing that, I may come over sort of weak and shaky. I could lose temperature control, all of that. And that's how it remained for a number of years.
Yeah.
And then I went and donated blood, as I had done countless times before. The donation itself went absolutely fine. They pulled the donation needle out of my arm. Felt a little bit lightheaded, a little bit foggy, but I thought, hey, you know what, that happens sometimes with this. And the next thing I know, it's 10 minutes later and I'm being woken up by all of the nurses because I've had a full tonic seizure with convulsions in the donation clinic. And none of us really knew what had happened.
So this is still pre-diagnosis?
That's still pre-diagnosis. I was only diagnosed properly when I was staying with a family friend, and I came over quite faint during a bit of a heated discussion, and sort of sat down and said, look, I'm not ignoring you. I'm not trying to deflect from this, but I need to take 5. And again, the next thing I know is they're panicking on the other side of the room trying to find a phone to call for an ambulance because I've suddenly hit the deck and I'm convulsing all over the place and they don't know what's going on. it was only after that second and hospitalizing seizure um, that the medical team that looked at me went, yeah, apparently we're supposed to wait for more tests to diagnose you, and we're going to have those tests done for safety, but no, this is definitely epilepsy that you're suffering from.
Right.
We're going to start medicating you now.
So it was essentially that chance encounter that led to all of that. There was no kind of any of the experience she's had before. Did you have any kind of thoughts about, like, what is this? Or did you just kind of think that, oh, this is just normal stuff that happens to people from time to time?
So with the lightheadedness and the faints, like the fainting feeling when I was a teenager, I've got erratic blood pressure. I've done forever. So I'd always put it down to that.
Okay.
Because, you have a sugary drink, you sit yourself down and you let everything return to normal and you feel fine again.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what I was doing, and it was working. So I had no other cause for concern. The only incident that sort of flipped from that was after one of these episodes. I lost feeling in one of my legs for a period of time. And when that was investigated, neurology said, like, we think that's a sort of a very, very minor potential stroke that's occurred, but it's not had any long-term effects on you. It's unlikely to reoccur. No need to worry.
Mm-hmm.
And even they were saying, in regards to the lightheaded and fainting episodes, with the sort of the knowledge that I had the erratic blood pressure, that yeah, that makes sense. So it was like I say, the chance encounters where there was somebody else to witness, I suppose, because I don't know if it had occurred historically and I'd just been on my own, so didn't know what had happened.
Yeah.
But those chance encounters are what actually led to my diagnosis.
Yeah. Okay. Wants to kind of like touch on, you talked about, it was during a particular like heated debate. Is there a link to the seizures and emotion? Like, it's high stress situations or intense situations, anything like that?
So there's nothing definitive. But as I'm sure you'll understand, lived experience says otherwise.
Yeah.
And I mean, it makes sense. Your blood gets pumping, the adrenaline starts running, you've got all of these other stresses going on. Your body reacts in strange ways.
Yeah.
And in my own experience, in all honesty, if I start to get stressed, then I do seem to experience more of these, and you'll hear me continue to refer to them as this, auras, even if I don't end up having a full-blown seizure.
Okay.
So I believe there is a link. I can't say that there is sort of a definitive medical agreement on it.
Yeah, absolutely. So after once you received the diagnosis, did you then start looking into some of these old situations and questioning yourself, or was that your medical team that did that?
So my medical team started to, among themselves, kind of ponder it. They didn't really mention it to me in the very beginning. Meanwhile, I was floundering and panicking a lot about this new diagnosis. I'd lost a friend during childhood to a spontaneous epileptic seizure.
Right.
So I was seeing the worst possible scenarios. Yeah. It was only once sort of I calmed down and I started to understand how, that so once in a million chance that's going to happen, yet alone it's going to happen to me as well. And I've got a medical team that are determined to figure this out. So let's figure it out. That my medical team sat down with me, and my neurologist in particular sat down with me and said, like, that these historic incidences, we think that it may have been an early sign of your epilepsy when you were a kid rather than, now, and that it's changed and developed as you've aged. Obviously, there's nothing that they can do about the past, but it does certainly make you start looking at it in a new light. And strangely, actually makes you appreciate how lucky you were back then that that was all that you had going on, and that you were able to deal with it without the worry.
Yeah. So right at the offset of the podcast, you mentioned that, when I asked about the person first language, you said there's a whole host of other things that come along with it. Is that for you, there's a whole host of things, or is it, this, like, I hate the phrase comorbidity. I'm sure we figured out a better way of saying comorbidity, because I just don't like, I don't like putting the word morbid in there. It
is a bit of an odd phrase.
Yeah. Simultaneous occurrences or something, I think, was what we came up with. But is it common that epilepsy comes along with other conditions, or is that just in your instance?
To be slightly pedantic in the phrasing,
okay,
because otherwise I know I'm going to get in trouble for for agreeing otherwise. It's quite common that other conditions can come along with epilepsy.
Okay.
I don't know if epilepsy can come along with other conditions.
Right.
So a couple of the other, one in particular, of the conditions within my little booklet, happens to quite often also in time have a diagnosis of epilepsy.
Okay. Right. And what is that? So
that is a diagnosis of cerebral palsy.
Okay.
Which is a neurological condition often developed very shortly after birth or prior to birth, where essentially things just don't always develop quite right in the brain, and it misbehaves in certain ways. And seemingly one of the things that can happen as a result of that, it short circuits randomly, and you end up with epilepsy as a result.
Right. Okay. So is that something that you received a diagnosis for around the same time, earlier, later? Where did that diagnosis come along?
Much earlier. I've actually been diagnosed with cerebral palsy since I was about 4 years old.
Oh, right.
I was diagnosed with epilepsy about 24 years old.
Right.
So, there's a big gap in that.
Yeah, absolutely. I know, obviously, I brought you on to talk about epilepsy, but while you're here, are you okay to answer a few questions about the CP?
Of course.
Yeah.
I'm an open book.
I mean, generally speaking, like, we are, with the purpose of the podcast is it's a mental health podcast, and we look at what I try to do by including a lot of different conditions that aren't necessarily considered mental health conditions per se, is I want to look at the impact of those conditions on a person's life. And I'd love to kind of get into a bit of that with both of these. So I suppose you said about coming with the diagnosis, and especially with them coming at different times, especially with the CP diagnosis being at the age of 4. Like, how did that diagnosis or that label affect you growing up?
So for a number of years, it kind of didn't.
Okay.
I was very, very young when I was diagnosed, and I'm quite lucky in that I have a spectacularly mild case of cerebral palsy. So apart from, the surgeries and periodically sort of using a wheelchair or wheelchair equivalent, and leg braces when I was younger, it didn't really impact me. and especially with the fact that I was in a mainstream school, but I was in a mainstream school with peers that had known me since day one.
Okay.
My diagnosis didn't even really impact any of that. For a number of years, everybody around me had always known me as that, and the CP diagnosis was completely secondary.
Okay. Well, that's good, I guess.
Yeah. In a strange way, it was. I lived these two sort of coexistent lives where I was very aware of my condition because my medical team were always very, very honest with me about the potential restrictions that it was going to have on my life, the potential risks and the potential life lessening impacts of CP, depending on sort of how I was able to adapt to it and how treatment went. Meanwhile, my peers didn't treat me any different to anyone else. So I was, on this one hand, very aware of a condition that could have a dramatic impact on my life. And yet, on the other hand, I was living the same life as any other kid that you could expect.
Okay.
It was only when I became a teenager of sort of 12, 13, and you're going through the British high school system. Actually,
it was only when you were surrounded by little shits, basically.
Yeah, exactly. The minute that you surround yourself with the most evil form of human being you will come across, that you become very much aware of the difference of the condition.
Yeah, I don't think we should go through puberty until we're like 25 and mature enough to do
honestly,
so.
It's a nightmare. But even there, in all honesty, I got quite lucky.
Yeah.
A lot of the peers from my primary school had also gone to the same high school as me, both those in my year group and those in year groups ahead of me. So even when I was confronted with your typical arseholery of, being picked on for being the disabled kid, because as much as people don't want to admit it, that's exactly what was happening.
Yeah.
I still had all of my previous peer groups surrounding me. I still had all of that support, and I still had a lot of them quite often vocally coming to my defense, even when I didn't know that things were being said. So I got lucky with a group of people around me.
That's a very refreshing story to hear. And I'm really glad that you had that group of friends, and especially the ones that, have got your back even when you're not there to need you, even there to be defended. It's I think that's such an empowering message to other people about how we can positively impact the lives of our friends who have various conditions by just supporting them. That's great that's great to hear.
I will never publicly applaud the exact reasons that this occurred, but I will always have in my memory going to my best friend, who from day one had been more like a brother to me than a friend, and saying to him, like, excuse my language, why the fuck have you been excluded? What happened? And him turning around to me and saying that actually he'd got in a punch up with one of his group of friends, one of his sort of clique, because he'd heard them say something about me and I wasn't there to defend myself. And it was like, you know what? I can't help but love that.
Yeah.
As much as I know we shouldn't, you shouldn't encourage that sort of, that is the most heartfelt that you could ever imagine.
Yeah.
Because I wasn't there. It was his clique of friends.
Yeah.
It
would have been so easy for him to just...
If he had done nothing, I would have never known.
Yeah. That's powerful. That's powerful. We don't directly condone violence, but at the same time, I had some very nice, warm feelings about that friend just now. So...
it's a very conflicting feeling.
We honestly, last Friday we were talking. I was bullied in school horrendously for the audacity of wearing glasses and being poor.
How dare you?
I know, and I only stood up for myself like twice, that both times I was excluded from school, and like we were talking about it on the well, not on the podcast, but on the call-in show on Friday, and it's just this, when it comes to like bullying, there's like, I know violence shouldn't be the answer, but it's like it's such a tricky situation, because in my situation it was like I told a teacher, and the next time that literally escalated for me. So like the next time the same bully came back at me, but came with a weapon, and I ran away from that school and never went back to that school. And that was like imprinted in me. You tell the teacher, it gets worse. And and I've got 2 teenage kids myself. And, you know, when they were kind of in the earlier stages of high school and bullying was becoming a bit of a problem, they were like, should I fight back? And I was like, the question you've always got to ask yourself is, how far is that person willing to go? Because you might be willing to go to hit them back, but if they're willing to get 5 people and gang up on you, if they're willing to bring a weapon to school, then no, I wouldn't recommend that, because, you know, in my scenario, I spoke up and that happened. So it's such no one has an answer. No one has the right answer for it.
I don't think that, and I mean, this is possibly controversial given what my career path is, but there isn't an answer to that question. People will tell you otherwise. People will tell you, you know, you should stand up, and if you fight back, they'll back away because bullies are cowards, or violence is never the answer. But none of that applies to every scenario.
Yeah.
And I don't think we're ever in a position to say, and until we're in those shoes.
Yeah, 100%. This was a random tangent, but I absolutely love it. It's like, at least I actually, for once, normally I don't know how we got to our tangents. Like on this show, I'll be like, how did I get that tangent and where did I start from? And today I can actually remember both. So my brain's working a little bit better than it usually does today. I'm very familiar with brain fog. And when you said about the thoughts swimming through custard, that will probably happen to me at about 3:25 on today's stream. It's like, it weirdly happens. Like my mods are like, you should finish an hour earlier. And I'm like, I really should, because my advice suddenly goes, like, words just suddenly stop coming out of my mouth. It's bizarre. It's so weird.
Yeah.
And for me, it's like, okay, it happens. Like when I asked about your situation happening, if it's like high stress or and for me, it's kind of, if I'm like working, processing constantly, like before we do this part of the show, we have a mental health support with the chat, and then we do another hour of mental health support after the chat, and it can really depend on like how intense the interview is, or how much we've got going on in the community at the start. So yeah, completely different situation, but I'm familiar. When you said about the brain thoughts swimming through custard, I was like, I might have to borrow that one. So it's
a surprisingly descriptive phrase.
I loved it, and someone else in chat commented on absolutely loving it as well. So obviously you said that diagnosis was pretty much always there from as young as you pretty much remember, and the second diagnosis was in your 20s. Like how was that experience different for you?
It was bizarre, you know, as a kid with that first diagnosis. And honestly, I wish I could say that this was a difference in medical team, but I mean, some of the guys on my current medical team had trained with the ones that were on the previous one. As a kid, they were very upfront and honest about everything, you know, life-limiting stuff. You may never be able to do this. We don't ever expect that you're going to be able to do this. Meanwhile, there's me jotting notes of all the challenges of things that I'm going to prove them wrong on.
I love that.
And they were very upfront and honest. Potentially, if I'd been any other kid, giving me a little bit too much information, potentially.
Yeah.
With the epilepsy diagnosis, I got none of that. I got, here's your diagnosis, here's the pill we're putting you on. Oh, wait, are you on any other medication? Okay, we should maybe put you on this one instead. Away you go, have fun, sort of scenario.
Wow.
And I always would have thought that should be the other way around. I was with that first one where I'm getting all the information. I'm a kid with parents looking after me. I don't need all the information to monitor my own condition and all of that. It helps later on, but with the epilepsy, I needed that information right there and then.
Yeah.
And it was only when I went back to the head of the team, my lead neurologist, and said, like, look, this, and this, give me answers, that he gave them to me, and I've been okay, like, getting information since. But they didn't seem to want to give that in the first instance.
Yeah. So what ways does having epilepsy, well, I'll do this question separately for epilepsy and for CP. What ways does having epilepsy impact you on a daily basis or on a regular basis?
So regularly, I literally have to shut down everything I'm doing. So I will get I call it an aura, and it's what it tends to be referred to sort of by the epileptic community, by those of us that have full tonic-clonic seizures, your full convulsive seizures.
Yeah.
And it's our early warning signal. It's, you need to stop now, or you're going to hit the deck and start jumping all over the place. In reality, it's actually a seizure of its own right. It's a frontal seizure. It just doesn't have the convulsions. And I will periodically, totally out of the blue, have to stop everything I'm doing and go and sit myself down close to the ground and just wait, and hope that it clears. Now that can be, a minute. It can be an hour. It could be a couple of days.
Wow.
And during that period of time where you are just waiting, you're fucked if you want to do anything, because that is your early warning. That's what you've got to warn you. So if you ignore that and you get up and you do something, there's a possibility that you're going to fall like a tree. You're gonna hit your head on something hard. You're gonna be jumping and convulsing all over the place. You're gonna do yourself some real damage. So you need to just sort of stop and wait and hope. And it comes totally without warning. It can happen while I'm cooking. It can happen while I'm at a gig. It can happen while I'm walking in the park with my goddaughter. There's no rhyme nor reason to it. Which sucks. And as I'm sure you can imagine, it also really impacts your ability to do a job 9 times out of 10 as well, because how the hell do you explain to your average employer, I'm not being lazy, but I need to sit and do nothing right now.
Yeah.
And I can't tell you when I'm going to be able to do something again.
Yeah.
But you work with it. And I think, in all honesty, the hardest part about that is I remember a time where that didn't occur to me.
Yeah.
I remember a time where that wasn't a thing I had to worry about. Otherwise, day to day, the hardest thing about it is other people, is my loved ones. Because everybody else worries about me having a seizure more than I do.
Right. Okay. That actually makes sense.
the big question, what do I do if you have a seizure? Put a pillow under my head and time it? Is there anything else I can do? No, not really. Is there anything I can do to stop them? No. Is there anything I should do after? Yeah, let me know what happened, because I won't remember.
Yeah.
I've got a symptom of it being my condition of living with it. I've got a very blasé attitude. There's nothing more that can be done. Don't worry. Let's just see it through to its end. We'll deal with it once we can.
Yeah.
Whereas all my loved ones are always super on edge, really worried, is it going to do lots of damage? Are you going to hurt you? I don't know, and there's no point worrying about it.
Yeah, and I guess they probably find it quite as a scary thing to watch when it's happening, and like probably have relayed that to you, which then becomes an additional stress for you. Is like, oh, I'm going to my seizure is going to be traumatic for my loved one, and yeah, I can in a very round the houses kind of way relate to some of that, in the fact that like my family are always a little bit more kind of concerned about my bipolar episodes than I am. And if I get, the thing is with bipolar episodes is if I get too concerned about them, it can help bring one on. I don't know if that works with epilepsy. It's like the more you kind of think about it, there's a psychosomatic thing going on. And now I'm using 10% of my capacity to think, to worry about the fact that I might get unwell.
Exactly. And to sort of bring us full circle on that question earlier of does stress sort of bring on seizures? Like, it seems like it could do. Yeah. And if I'm worried about trying to figure out what do I do if I have a seizure, what do these people do if I have a seizure? Is there anything they can do if I have a seizure? I'm more likely to have one.
yeah. I get it. I guess there's probably people as well that kind of handle the seizures better than others as well. There's like we're not going to out anyone directly, but yeah, I bet and you'll probably find yourself being more comfortable when you're in the company of those people than when the ones that like get into a little bit of a flap, maybe.
Yeah, definitely. I've got one friend in particular, and she has to deal with epileptic seizures on a regular basis as a result of her job. When she found out that I had epilepsy, she interrogated me like a medical professional, which was hilarious. I know if I ever have a seizure around her, she's not going to treat me like I'm a friend. She's going to treat me like a client, and she's fabulous.
Yeah.
Not a concern in the world in regards to when I'm around her. Yeah. A, because she knows what to do, and B, I know that anybody else that's worrying, she's going to calm them down just because of how much she instinctively knows and how little she will be worrying.
Yeah. So while we're talking about other people, this links quite nicely into the next question, which is, what is the difference between how the public generally view epilepsy and the reality of it?
The public seem to have one view of epilepsy, and it is tonic-clonic photosensitive epilepsy.
Yeah.
I see flashing lights, I'm on the floor doing an electro dance kind of reaction. That's not the reality. It's so far removed from the reality that I can't even describe it properly. There are types of seizure where you don't lose consciousness whatsoever. You just kind of go a little bit cloudy.
Mm-hmm.
There are types of seizure that you are having a convulsive seizure on the floor, but it's not been triggered by flashing lights of any form. There are people that, despite being photosensitive, can be on medication that actually subdues their seizures to a point where they may as well not be photosensitive at all. That there are so many variations on epilepsy that the public have grabbed one end of the stick and said this is epilepsy, and they're not seeing the whole spectrum.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm infamous in my friend group for making jokes when there are strobing lights around me of, well, glad I'm not. But there are people that have met me, know I'm epileptic, that they see a strobing light, and I've had people almost dive in front of lights in an effort to stop me seeing them, and it's like, doesn't affect me whatsoever. Don't worry about it. Ask me questions.
Yeah.
Ask me about my condition. I'm an open book. There are other people that they think that a seizure is always a life-altering effect, where you are terrified when you come out of them, and you don't know what your life is going to be like after. Again, I've got a little bit of a horrible sort of reputation among my loved ones. They don't know when I've had a hospitalized seizure until I'm in hospital, and I'm letting them all know sort of after the fact. And I've developed this horrible reputation for sending them a short clip of me hooked up to the ECG with, your typical drip in it, overlaid with the song by Metro Station, Shake It, of looks like I've just had a seizure with shaking again. And I turn it into a joke because it's my life, and if you spend your whole time worrying about it, scared about it, then I think it has more impact on you than the condition itself.
I 100% agree. And I think we've seen this with many, many different conditions that we've talked about on this show, is that because I used to describe myself at one point, when we talked at the very beginning of the show, we talked about like the person first language and stuff. And so I went through a period of, well, actually I still do to myself, describe myself as I am someone who suffers from the symptoms of bipolar, or is prone to the symptoms of bipolar disorder. Because I have bipolar disorder was a very all or nothing statement for me. Like, I don't mind I'll use those terms when I explain it to other people, because I'm like, if you go and say, yes, what's your condition? And I was like, I'm prone to the symptoms of bipolar disorder. But what that meant to me was, if you say I have a cold, it means you have a cold. You are actively experiencing a cold. If you say, but if you kind of say, I get colds more frequently than others, people understand what that means. And that's the same. It's like, you said about the doctors giving you a lot of information and then not so much at various stages. At 14, I was given no information except for, it means you're going to have big highs and low lows. And no one told me I was going to have middle bits. And honestly, for like 10 years, that my entire experience was either one end or the other. Now, it actually wasn't. I just didn't pay attention to the bit in the middle. I didn't pay attention to the part of my life where I was asymptomatic. And what you said there is like, if someone's paying, if I spend all of my time worrying about whether a depressive episode is coming or not, then it's like a mini depressive episode in itself.
You bring yourself into one, don't you?
Well, sometimes I bring myself into one, but I certainly take myself out of the normal. Like, in that moment, it doesn't always guarantee that I'll go into one, but it'll dull the happiness. It'll take the shine off things in my day-to-day life. And worrying about a depressive episode never stopped one from coming. In fact, if anything, it helped them come on faster. And also trying to slow down manic episodes in the past used to always kind of just make me think, would sometimes slow them down, would sometimes make them a little bit worse, would sometimes just make me crash immediately. And now I just let whatever's happening. And I'm much better for it. Like, there's no point thinking about what emotion you're going to have today, because as soon as you think about a different emotion anyway, it brings the emotion into now anyway. So, if someone remembers a bad memory, they feel the emotions that go along with that. If someone remembers a good memory, they feel the emotions that go along with that. If you project into a future projection of a good or a bad situation, you feel whatever goes along with that. It's how bloody anxiety works. It's projected into the worst case scenario of all the things that could possibly go wrong.
Yeah, and in all honesty, I think deep down, that's why I turn my hospitalization episodes into a joke.
Yeah.
Why I turn them into an incredibly dark and morbid, but a joke.
Yeah.
Because
you're attaching a completely different emotion to that experience than the one that comes as default.
Yeah.
Or maybe
not even funny. I can't be scared by it.
Yeah. I love it. I absolutely love it.
I didn't get that.
Shut up, Siri. You're not supposed to be listening. Siri didn't get it, but we did. It's okay. I was going to ask that question about the two different conditions, like side by side, but then we were already talking about external, like what the differences were that other people. Actually, before I move back to there, Do you think it's the reason that most people think of photosensitive epilepsy is because it's like on the beginning of video games, it's on TV shows sometimes if there's strobing
It's
effects.
the big media push.
It's advertised. It's the poster child of epilepsy, basically.
It's that big push. You know, you go to the theatre and it says like, you know, this show has flashing lights. It's on the front of video games. It's everywhere. It makes total sense.
Yeah.
For it to be everywhere. For somebody that is photosensitive, you know, they need that information at the very forefront, and they need every opportunity where it might be relevant.
Yeah.
Because you don't want to risk it perhaps being relevant and not giving the information. And it turns out it was. So of course, you know, it's in the public eye a lot more. But I also think that the public aren't even given an inkling that there are variations to the condition. And I think that's where that problem lies.
Yeah.
Is that they're not given the inkling. You know, I wouldn't expect for everybody to be educated in the hundreds of different forms of epilepsy. Hell, I'm epileptic and I'm not.
Yeah.
But I do think if people knew a little bit more about the fact that, you know, epilepsy does have variations, that people might be a little bit more inclined to look. And crucially, actually, for me, people might examine themselves and think, oh, actually, do I need to talk to a doctor about these things? Because that seems to be mimicking what I'm hearing about this.
Yeah.
Because when we look at the fact that, you know, I had undiagnosed epilepsy all through my teenage years, I didn't put down to epilepsy because I didn't realize it could have been. I could have found out earlier if that had been in the public sphere.
Yeah, definitely, 100%. Okay, so I'm going to go back to those previous two questions, but I guess ask them about cerebral palsy, if that's okay. So basically, how does that impact you on a day-to-day or a regular basis?
Nowadays, it doesn't. Not really. I have a couple of days where I am particularly weak in limbs or in sort of my coordination, where it decides that it wants to be a particular pain in my ass. But otherwise, it doesn't so much any longer. There are a couple of bits where I know it will come to impact me down the road, but hey ho. When I was a kid, I struggled a lot with basic coordination of really minor tasks. You know, holding a knife and fork and using it. Couldn't do that. Walking without full leg braces. Was told I'd never be able to do that. Ha ha ha, proof them wrong, don't use them at all any longer. Was told that I'd sort of never have the strength, balance and coordination to be able to do things like rock climbing and abseiling. Again, that's another challenge that I set myself. I beat that one.
Your bucket list is literally made on.
Oh yeah, everything the big super qualified medical professionals went, you can't do that. I went,
It's like people
sure.
like, have you ever written a bucket list? No, my doctors wrote it for me.
Exactly. You know, it caused difficulty with the very process of walking. That's one of the things that I know will come to hit me at some point in the future. I don't walk like a normal person. I hitch at the hip more than rotating.
Okay.
As a result, I know that my hips are worn down a lot faster than you would expect, to the point where I was actually told I would need more than likely a full hip replacement by the time I turned 20. 26 and still waiting for that. So again, good on that one. And yeah, it's things like that. I think it's also important to acknowledge that cerebral palsy does fall onto the autistic spectrum. So a lot of the general symptoms of autism I can sometimes exhibit. But again, I have a very mild case, so don't take my experience as representative. Although from what I've gathered of you and your community, that's not a risk.
No, we don't. We basically, like, we've covered epilepsy entirely on this one episode. No, we are like, I have other bipolars on to talk about bipolar from their perspective. Yeah, it's like we don't, and that's an important thing to kind of remember with any condition, is that you'll learn new things from pretty much talking to every single person definitely. You speak to, and there might be common overlaps, but we're all individual humans at the end of the day. And
I mean, controversially, walking down the high street, I can spot another person with cerebral palsy a mile away, because I spot my own hidden tells in other people. The really deeply hidden ones that people don't notice in me, I spot in other people. So I can easily sort of tell when somebody's got cerebral palsy. No way could I tell you how it impacts them.
Yeah, absolutely.
That there is that broad diagnostic side of things of that person has, and there is how that person actually lives with it.
Yeah. Well, I can't tell if someone's bipolar walking down the high street, because we don't walk down the high street. We hide in caves.
No.
It's not true. It's a joke, people. Anyway, so going back to like the public sort of what's the expectations versus reality, what is the public kind of view of cerebral palsy versus what is the reality?
Everybody expects for somebody with cerebral palsy to, and I know people with cerebral palsy like this, to have an incredibly reduced mental age, to be physically almost entirely dependent on other people. You know, that incredibly offensive stereotype of the disabled person trying to eat their own shoulder.
Mm-hmm.
That is what a lot of people expect. To the point where I've had people in my day job find out that I have cerebral palsy and argue with me about it and say that I don't. Because how could I have that condition and be doing my job?
Yeah.
And it's like, well, I'm here. And that is the public reaction.
Yeah. I mean, it's like I say that within the spectrum of like mental health, and even within the spectrum of physical health, each condition has its own spectrum. It's like it's like a double spectrum. It's like, I don't know, like no two people with bipolar disorder are the same. No two people with CP are the same. And yeah, I'm still a little bit shocked that someone would outright argue with you. And I know I've heard the expression, you don't look bipolar. It's like, yeah, okay, cool. I have got a T-shirt that's got a bipolar bear on it. It's like half a grizzly bear, half a polar bear, and it's got bipolar written underneath it. Maybe I look bipolar when I'm wearing that, but it's like
it really brings up the seemingly becoming more and more popular joke of, you don't look autistic. Oh, sorry. Would you like me to do an autism? Like that is the response from a lot of people.
Yeah, it's like you don't look autistic. It's like, well, you didn't sound ignorant until 1 second ago.
Yeah, you don't look autistic. Well, you didn't sound like a twat.
Oh. Amazing. Yeah. So, okay. So I suppose we sort of touched on the reality, but the reality is that there is a spectrum there. Is there anything else for the reality that you'd like to add? Like, what is the reality of CP?
it's a condition that you can so easily learn to live with, that you forget you have it. I regularly do. And it's a condition I've had since day dot. It's developed shortly after or shortly before birth. But I think the reality of it is that life goes on as normal, and that people just don't always realize that.
Mm-hmm.
And the worst part about CP, and I have to be brutally honest, the worst part about it is the question from other people when you hit your 20s and beyond of, should that person look after, or should that person have kids? So wrong. Shouldn't be a question. The reality of the sort of situation is, my CP is not genetic. It's not something that can be passed on. And it should never be somebody else's decision to say that person can't or shouldn't. It should be up to me and my partner, and that's it.
Yeah.
The rest of the world kind of needs to learn to bite its head out of that question.
Yeah, definitely. I'm going to jump over to some of the questions from chat, if that's cool.
Of course.
We're coming up to the end of the time. But basically, Bob Blushing-Crafter says, are there some types of seizures that happen more often for you?
Yes, my auras happen a hell of a lot more often than I have a full-blown sort of convulsive seizure. As I've explained, the auras, for me, they're a warning signal that I am aware that they are a seizure in their own right.
Yeah. Now, do they always, or do they often precede a full-blown seizure?
Often.
So sometimes you don't get the warning sign whatsoever. Sometimes
I can have the aura but never have the seizure.
Yeah.
And I can have a seizure without the aura.
Right.
They both occur. So it's a nuisance. But those auras occur so much more regularly. That very lightheaded, I feel very faint, I feel very weak, I can't think straight sort of seizure. That's my most common seizure.
Yeah.
The on the floor jumping around and actually convulsing, significantly more rare in comparison.
Okay.
I'm most likely to have those types of seizure, oddly, when I'm asleep.
Oh.
Which is when they're most concerning, because I can't always tell if I've had a seizure when I've been asleep, and you kind of need to know when you've had a seizure.
Right.
But yeah, that's that.
Okay. That actually answers the follow-up question I was going to ask to that, which was, if you have one in your sleep, can you always tell? So Lexi says, did the first medication they tried you on work, or have you had to deal with the meds testing roller coaster? I have a friend who was diagnosed with epilepsy very young, and now in her 20s, they're still chopping and changing their meds every so often to try and improve things, but they don't always help.
So, sort of a midpoint on that one. I can't tell you if the first medication they put me on worked. They changed that within 48 hours. My neurologist came round and asked me what other drugs I was on. When I told him, he instantly changed the epilepsy control medication, because he knew that there were some interactions between that and a couple of the other medications that I'm on. And his argument was, we know that the other drugs you're on are working for those conditions, so let's not try and change them to work with this. Let's find the medication that works for this that doesn't interact with them.
Okay.
The medication that I'm on now, I'm on a medication called lamotrigine. It's actually an antipsychotic as well, which is a really odd combination. It does work for me. I've had to sort of jump between dosages every now and then. Sometimes I need the dosage upped for no apparent reason. I'm lucky enough that my neurologist, I've got a direct line through to his secretary.
Okay.
And they're always really good. If I explain that, I've been suffering from more auras and more seizures than I would ordinarily expect, then he will up the dosage. He will say, come back to me in a couple of weeks, and let me know how this is going. If in a week you are still having this many seizures, phone me again. We will up the drugs again. If it doesn't work, then we'll look at changing the medication if that's what we need to do. I've been astoundingly lucky.
Mm-hmm. Okay. This one's also from Lexi. How do you feel after a seizure? Is there a hangover-like experience, or is everything totally fine again?
I have total amnesia of about 15 minutes before and after the seizure.
Right.
Cannot remember it. And then that fades. I slowly start to unfog those memories, and develop some memory of what had occurred. I do have a hangover-like effect, though, for a number of 2-3 hours or so. I exist in a state where I know I won't get an aura again. I'm sort of in a semi-state of aura where it's like, I don't know if I'm going to have another seizure again, but this isn't an aura.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very odd situation to exist in. And I'm very cautious during that period of time. I have had one instance, and I suppose a warning for anybody that ever experiences this. I had a series of 5 consecutive seizures, where, as I was coming out of the seizure, before I would properly sort of regain consciousness, I would slip back into another seizure.
Mm-hmm.
As a result of that, I actually got stuck in a state of aura. I was in a constant state of aura for 4 days, where it just was continuously there. And my neurologist had to give me seizure rescue meds, essentially, despite the fact that I was not having a full-blown seizure, as well as upping my medication to essentially jumpstart the brain and tell it, no, you're not still coming out of or in a seizure, you're okay.
Mm-hmm.
Because what had happened was, where I was coming out of and then jumped straight into another seizure, that sort of chemical process in the brain got a little bit confused.
Yeah.
And my brain just did not know what was happening any longer, and worked on the safer than sorry idea of, you're having an aura, despite the fact that it had been 4 days since my seizure.
Yeah. One last question from chat, from Blushing Crafter. Are there things that those close to you, your partner and such, can do to support you after the seizures?
Cup of tea, let me know what happened. Try not to panic too much.
Yeah.
If you feel that you particularly love me lots, nice strong espresso is always good. All those personal vices. Honestly, and this is something that I would sort of try and preach to the wider public as well, because I know that it's terrifying to watch somebody have a seizure, and I know that there is that almost intrinsic guilt of, I wish there's something I could do. Is there anything I can do? 9 times out of 10, no, there really isn't. Just kind of support however you're asked to at that point. If that person just wants to sit and figure it out and have a cup of coffee, then that's what they want.
Yeah.
That's what they need. It varies by person and by seizure. You know, sometimes I've got a seizure where I come out of it and my first response is, okay, I need to phone the hospital. Sometimes I have a seizure and I come out of it and I go, the pub? You know, there's those.
And then sometimes it's like, is there a pub on the way to the hospital?
Haven't had that one. Probably will now.
It was a self-fulfilling prophecy. Is there anything else that you'd like to add on anything we've discussed or any other topics that my questions haven't led you towards?
I think the only thing that I would say, and I have an inkling, having sort of jumped into your stream for 15 minutes before this, that I'm preaching to the choir here. But in regards to both of the conditions I have that we've discussed, and all of my conditions overall, you don't know a person's got them until they tell you. They don't necessarily stop someone doing any job or any activity, anything. Don't believe that's the case. That, you know, somebody can't have this because they're doing this, or shouldn't be doing this because they have this. Everybody is different. And the only way that you will learn about somebody's condition and how it impacts them is getting to know that person.
I absolutely love that, and I love the fact that that's where we're ending as well. Is there if people want to reach out, like message you, get in touch, if that's something that you do, not everyone does. Again, streamer space, yeah, lots of people people can reach out, but where's the best place for people to do that?
So honestly, the best place to reach out to me is in my Twitter. Either publicly mention me if you want to be one of those people, or drop me a DM. They are open. And I know that my or a link to my account has been running through your chat. I'm a public advocate. I freelance as a campaigner, so you know I'm already in the public eye for a lot of things. It's not something that I'm adverse to people coming out and saying, "Hey, can you tell me about this?" or "What is it about this?" or "What do you think about this?" If you've got any questions about my conditions, or when you look at my feed and potentially get an idea of what it is I do for a living, any of that, ask. I'm always available. It may take 3 to 4 working days for me to get back to you, depending on the brain fog. But you will eventually get a response. And if I may be presumptuous, Dave, any questions that they want that they're not too sure coming to me, they send them to you and you want to pass them on. I'm more than happy for that to happen as well.
More than happy for that. So the Twitter is twitter.com/blinkandburn. Is that correct? And also, Lindsay's putting a link to a WordPress. Is that the best place for people? Heartofachange.wordpress.com.
Heart of a Change, mate. The Heart of a Change. It's an old WordPress that is going to be going active again shortly. Okay. So that is actually incredibly fortuitous.
Lindsay's our community manager, and she does. I log in on Tuesday and see that the links have all been updated, and I'm just like, oh, this is so good, because not only would I have totally forgotten to have done it, I'd have been like I sent you the link to this Zoom call like 25 minutes before we started, because that's just the way my brain works. But yeah, it's cool. As glad that that'll be coming back up as well. So that was heartofachange.wordpress.com.
Yeah. That follows a little bit more of my sort of my social work profession.
Okay.
But again, there is a contact form there. Feel free to use it. Heads up, if you do, you might not get me respond. You might get my editor respond.
Oh.
But said editor is also my adoptive sister, so it will come to me at some point.
Amazing. Well, Charlie, thank you so much for your time today, and for indulging me as I took us into two topics rather than one. And it was absolutely fantastic learning from you.
No worries, my absolute pleasure, Dave. And well, I think we'll probably be staying in touch based on all of this. Honestly,
I hope so. I feel like you alluded to a few other things that we could talk about at some point. You say,